we as Indigenous people experience unique challenges. Challenges that are state-centered and state-driven, non-targeted financing. So we are a unique constituency that requires unique targeting. Second is that the reality of our historical marginalization and continued exclusion and violation of our rights, with a very minimal voice in decision making and planning, which means general applicable policies will not reach us because we are not in the negotiation table. What are some of the aspirations of the policy? Number one is that it recognizes that Indigenous people have something they can contribute with respect to mitigation and adaptation to climate change, or to enable Indigenous people contribution to solutions. Second is to guarantee equitable opportunities in terms of sustainable access to climate resources, in terms of outcomes and addressing impacts. Third is also to avoid causing any harm when projects are implemented. So adverse impacts of climate action, because as much as climate change is a risk to Indigenous people, direct impact, so are proposed actions that are not safeguarded. And this is the aspect of do no harm that the policy tries to address. The policy also aspires to provide foundation for respecting the rights in the entire spectrum and initiatives of the Green Climate Fund, including compliance to international instruments and mechanisms on rights, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which the ILO Convention number 169, which the policy actually speaks to. The policy also aspires to respect customary ownership of land and territories by Indigenous people. The policy recognizes, commits to respect Indigenous knowledge systems and practices around climate change. It actually recognizes the linkage between our cultural value systems, our spiritual heritage and values with climate change mitigation and action, and commits to actually recognize and respect these value systems. The policy also actually seeks to enable the application of free, prior and informed consent as a foundational principle for engaging with Indigenous people. And also the policy seeks to ensure sustained, robust engagement with Indigenous people in GCF supported activities or projects. The policy is applicable to all GCF finance activities. So irrespective of all funding arrangement or modalities, whether it's a loan, whether it's a grant, whether it's an integrated approach to financing, it is irrespective of a financial arrangement to the project. Because basically, whenever there is GCF money, independent of other additional resources, the policy is applicable. It is also applicable whenever Indigenous people or a group self-identify as Indigenous people. And this is very important, that one of the triggers of the policy is self-identification, including those groups who are collectively owning their land and managing their land together, including where customary institutions and minority languages are applicable. It has a very broad and inclusive appreciation of terms used in describing Indigenous people, whether they are Indigenous minorities. So the policy is clear that whenever Indigenous people are present in a project area, so once a group of Indigenous people is present, the policy by default should actually be applied. And that triggering is irrespective of whether actually the impacts are presumed to be positive or negative. It is applicable irrespective of the scale of the impact. You cannot say the impacts will be minimal, so the policy is not necessary to apply. The policy, very, very important, is actually applicable even in the absence of recognition of indigenous people by the country in question. So long as there is self-identification by indigenous people, even when the state does not recognize their being there, the policy is applicable. And then I've already said, of course, the policy is applicable irrespective of the absence or presence of discernible economic and political vulnerabilities. So the policy is very generous in seeking to address and safeguard the interests of indigenous people. So if we look at the principles that the policy seeks to respect and adhere to and promote, one is free and informed consent. We know that for us as indigenous people, this is the basic standard of engaging with us as articulated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The policy, one of the other principles is that it seeks not to violate indigenous people's rights to land and territories. And this is again where most of our violation has happened. Our rights to land have always been the main contention, but the policy seeks to safeguard. It actually seeks to respect indigenous people in voluntary isolation. Again, a very, very high threshold. These are indigenous people who want to self-isolate away from the state control. And the policy aspires to respect this. And I've already mentioned that the other principle is around respecting international human rights standards. Also critical is that it seeks to recognize and respect our traditional knowledge and livelihood system. So is any project that seeks to radically transform traditional occupation, the policy will, the Green Climate Fund should not support such an activity. The policy recognizes the need to establish capacities of indigenous people to engage with the GCF and the capacity of GCF staff to engage with the indigenous people agenda. While we have always fought for a direct access arrangement of GCF resources, we haven't gotten it as much, but we have a foothold. We have a placeholder. The policy says the board should work towards facilitating direct access of GCF resources to indigenous people. So while a mechanism is not established, a foothold and a placeholder for this is actually provided for. The key purpose of this policy is to ensure that indigenous people are fully informed and consulted about and have opportunities to actively participate in the design and implementation of the project. So basically, that indigenous people should be at the heart of GCF programming and implementation of projects done within their territories. So what are some of the requirements of this policy? First is that it places a burden of implementation. The burden of respecting these provisions is placed on these accredited entities. And they're actually supposed to develop these IPPs, Indigenous People Plans, and IPPFs, Indigenous People Planning Frameworks. These are instruments to deliver these safeguards and benefits to indigenous people in the context of a Green Climate Fund project. One of the other requirements, of course, is to avoid adverse impact of projects on indigenous people, including strategies such as avoiding this harm, providing alternative approaches, minimizing and compensating for any negative impacts done. The other requirement is actually to address the issue of development benefits, that these benefits associated with projects should be mutually agreed between indigenous people and the implementing entity. They should be culturally appropriate, and the benefits to Indigenous people should be commensurate with the risks. If risks are high, the benefits must also be high. Furthermore, the other around meaningful consultation tailored for Indigenous people. And these are very important principles for our engagement. One is that they should be culturally appropriate, so gender and intergenerational inclusivity, meaning youth, women, elders, and information disclosure should be fully provided for. There must be strong complementarity between this policy and the safeguards policies. The policy clarifies circumstances within which free, prior, and informed consent must be applied. And these are when land tenure is going to be interrupted, when relocation and cultural heritage might be interfered with, and also sets a foundation for grievance redress mechanisms. So how is it to be implemented? What are responsibilities of different actors in the implementation of the policy? One is a board of the Green Climate Fund, and the highest organ of the fund has a responsibility to oversee implementation and compliance. So when the policy is not fully applied, the board has a responsibility to ask questions and enforce its application. Second is a Secretariat of the Green Climate Fund and the accredited entities. This is where compliance in practice is actually enacted, and where assessment, annual assessment, and continuous assessment of how the policy is performing is undertaken. Most important is also the organ of direct representation of Indigenous, which is the Indigenous People Advisory Group. This group, with 4 Indigenous people, 1 from Asia, 1 from Pacific, and 1 from Africa, 1 from Latin America, provide the link between the GCF actors, the countries, basically NDAs, accredited entities, and Indigenous people.